Hello, everyone. I am joined here by our teaching assistant for this semester, whose name you have seen, and you've probably gotten emails from him, Joshua Rutherford. Welcome, Joshua. And we're going to be talking about some prints and print processes, particularly around reproductions of works by some of the major artists that are discussed in this week's module in 16th century Italy. And we thought it would be, this was really Joshua's idea, but we thought it would be great to talk about some of these reproductions of these very famous works. And we're going to focus especially on Leonardo's Mona Lisa. And in part because it is so familiar, I've talked about it in multiple videos, and it has been subject to a lot of different reproductions and reveals a lot about questions of value and, how images actually circulate and how people come to know them. And when I was putting together some of the slides for this, I came across one that I include in one of my lectures for my prints course, which has just this bold statement that says the primary way, and I think it's important to underscore this, the primary way that most people experienced art from the 15th century up through the 20th century was through prints. Unless you actually went to a museum, which was, their museums didn't exist until the 19th century, really. Unless you had access to the works themselves, and very few people did, you would become familiar with these through prints, and it's hard to overemphasize how important that is. So, and especially with a work like Mona Lisa, I think that's really important to keep in mind. So welcome, Joshua.
Hey, y'all. I know I haven't introduced myself, but I'm Joshua. I'm a graduate student. My work focuses on Confederate monuments right now and the performances surrounding Confederate monuments. But I'm also very interested in the rise of nationalism and print culture and, the whole idea of the printing press in general. So I'm really excited to be talking about this today. This is very near and dear to my heart, as is Leonardo, who's the reason I became an art historian or decided to become an art historian when I was 9. Yeah, I'm a left-handed person. I was obsessed with art when I was a kid, but my mom got me a book on Leonardo because I was self-conscious about being left-handed. She got me a book about Leonardo and his journals when I was a kid, and I thought it was really cool. And so very near and dear to my heart.
It's here, have a book on Leonardo and be plagued by massive inferiority complexes for the rest of your life.
A little bit of that. I think my dad was involved too, because my dad's an engineer. So he was maybe he'll get into science if I give him this, but I took the art away from it. So
my dad is a scientist too, so that's interesting. Awesome. Do you want to share the PowerPoint?
Yes, I will share the PowerPoint. All right. We good?
Yep.
Cool.
So here we obviously have the painting, the Mona Lisa, which we've heard about this week, painting by Leonardo that exists in the Louvre in Paris. And then if you want to just click to the next slide, I don't know, often when I talk about the subject of prints and what we're talking about today is a form of printmaking called reproductive printmaking, which is where prints are made after existing works like paintings, like the Mona Lisa. And I often, when I'm talking about reproductive prints and the Mona Lisa in particular, I bring up these two images because these are often cited as some of the major reasons for why the Mona Lisa is so famous. So on the left there is a photograph from when it was stolen from the Louvre in, I believe, 1911.
Yeah, 1911.
Okay, yeah, and it was actually there was a theory, and I believe I think he might have been arrested for it. The poet Guillaume Apollinaire was accused of having stolen it. I think he was I mean, it was kind of like a prank, it being stolen. So that brought a lot of attention to the painting, the fact that it was stolen. And I think it was like maybe several days went by before anyone even realized that it had been stolen. I mean, they noticed that it wasn't there, but I think people thought maybe it had been taken away for cleaning or restoration or something. So it took some time before people realized that it was stolen. And that definitely brought a lot more attention to the painting. And then, of course, you have books like Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, which has all these theories and, speculations about it being, coded for some nonsense that doesn't make any sense and is not rooted in reality or fact. But anyway, it is another kind of more recent example of the Mona Lisa in popular culture that's brought a lot of attention to it. So, but I want to sort of underscore things that I've already said already. One, which is that the Mona Lisa became so famous again primarily through printmaking. This was when it was stolen in 1911. By that point, there would have been some photographic reproductions of the work, but photography only came about. It only sort of became available at the end of the 1830s, and we're in our timeline for our course, we're still a ways away from this. But just to situate you, photography was around in the 19th century, but it was a long time before it was possible to make very high, relatively high quality color reproductions of the Mona Lisa. In 1911, when it was stolen, color photography had not advanced to the point where you could have a really good color reproduction of the Mona Lisa, at least not that I can think of. So
already had to be famous at that point, because why would you steal something that's not famous, from the Louvre?
Right, absolutely. So it kind of was, and Joshua and I both this week read this article about one of the prints we're going to look at, and part of the argument is that it's through these prints, and one in particular, that it gained a lot of the attention that it got. So it's not just that the prints sort of, the reproductions sort of helped perpetuate its fame, but rather that the prints established it was only through the prints that this work became famous in the 19th century.
Yep. I think the stealing is like such a funny story. Like, I love the Guillaume Apollinaire connection, but like, I think it was like a guard that that coordinated the whole thing, and they say that he just stuck it in his coat and walked out with it. I think it's so outlandish that like something like that could happen with the Mona Lisa at one point in its life, like after it had become something famous.
Yeah, and I mean, if anyone has been to the Louvre today, or really in the past, I don't know, 30, 40 years, it would be impossible.
I mean, behind like sheet glass, right?
It's behind sheet glass. There's sensors, and plus there's always throngs of people in front of it. And it's not very big, which is, it's often surprising to realize until you see a photo of the gallery and actually see it in space. But it's not very big, but there's always just tons and tons of people in front of it. Nobody paying attention to the ginormous Veronese painting that's directly behind it, and that actually in this photograph you can see the edge of it there up at the top. These are the two earliest ones. Well, maybe we can just.
I think it's good to talk a little bit about these. Like, okay. I think it's cool to like think about how these simple drawings were the only way that people saw it before, like these higher quality reproductive engravings came around. I mean, in 1651, this is the only way people would have known the Mona Lisa unless they had seen it in person. And in 1651, it probably would have been very, very private, because it was in like the royal collection in France at that point, right?
Yeah. So the what became the Louvre, the public museum, it was royal collections, and that basically, when the French Revolution happens, which we'll get to later, the property of the royalty and of the churches, basically all churches in France, are declared property of the state, and it's one of the initiatives of a very significant revolutionary and also very significant painter who we'll get to later, Jacques-Louis David. It was him who argued for the establishment of this public museum, making this stuff available. Really, it was more for students of art, but there were a couple days a week that that average citizens could come and view it. So yeah, exactly. Up until that point, these kinds of works would not have been actually visible to, you know, hardly anybody. So you're right.
So this is the public consciousness of the Mona Lisa in these periods, like before the reproductive engraving, and that's not even comparable, right?
Yeah. So let's do a little visual analysis of these two, and kind of talk about, you know, what changes in these two. So these are reproductions that, as you see in the captions, were included in books. So they're prints in books that are French. The one up top is a French edition. The one on the right is an English edition of one of Leonardo's writings, his treatise on painting. So this is an image that was used basically to illustrate a certain concept that Leonardo discusses in his treatise. So let's talk about how they're different.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine they're woodcuts, or something similar to a woodcut that was like done from a drawing. But this one is like uncorrected, like it's reversed. And I'm guessing it was printed that way because it was probably carved that way, or I don't know how they reproduced drawings at that point. I'm imagining a woodcut.
These, I think, I'm not sure on the one on the left, but the one on the right looks to me like it is probably an engraving or an etching.
Yeah,
probably looks like an etching, and part of that, I'm getting really weedsy and print specialist here, but if you can see, so on the one on the right, up above the image, there's that, you know, front P146. Just above that, you can see a very faint line.
Yes.
And that is most likely what we call a plate mark. And so that's a key way of telling if a print is a relief print or an intaglio print. And so that leads me, and I can't see very closely my own image, you know, this is from one of my own lectures, but
I think you're right. I think that's like the beveled edge of like one of those plates.
Yeah.
There.
And the face itself, and or the image itself, it looks kind of stippled and scrawling like etchings do. And we haven't gotten to etchings in the course yet, but again, this is weedsy stuff you don't need to worry about. But let's go back to the images and how they differ.
I like the eyes are just not right in either one of them. And in this one, the nose is like super elongated and skinny. And like the nose has a lot more like body and depth to it on the original painting of the Mona Lisa. And same with this one. The nose is like, it seems like it's very short and like, I don't know, the shape of the nose is just way off on both of them. The mouth on this one is like, it's not even comparable. I mean, there's just the Mona Lisa's smile is so subtle. There's so much detail in it, and just the way this subtle curve happens, but the way that Leonardo's technique blended in with the used color to actually emphasize the musculature of the face. It's completely lost here. This one I feel like captures maybe a little bit of it. They have a little bit of delicate, like kind of chiaroscuro shadow work. Like it's an attempt at chiaroscuro, but because there's no atmospheric perspective here,
there's nothing back there.
It feels wrong. Wrong, and the whole landscape is such a significant part of this that, I mean, it just, without the landscape there, I feel like you're missing almost the entire image, right? Like I feel like it's gone. It's not really there.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, and I think it being reversed is an important thing to point out, and that's something that happens in with prints. You know, if you are just reproducing it on a plate, like just looking at the Mona Lisa and drawing it, it's going to be the correct orientation on the plate or in your drawing. But when it's printed, it's going to be in reverse. So the one on the right, whoever did that design accounted for that and would have done their design in the reverse so that when it's printed, it's in the correct orientation. So there's a lot of thinking and strategizing that one has to consider with these kinds of things. So, I totally agree that the one on the left kind of more accurately captures the face than the one on the right, but the one on the left is not, and that makes sense because we know that
It's
they would have been
reversed,
looking
yeah.
at it. Yeah, they would have been looking at it, reproducing it in the correct orientation, but then it gets reversed in the reproduction. I'm also
Like
really,
the hands are
Mhm.
gone. Like,
Yeah.
go on though.
No, and I think it's also one of the things that's interesting that comes through for me looking at these closely is the presence of the veil and just the very different visual quality that it has. It seems so uh translucent and barely there in the painting, to the point like you really have to look closely to note that it is there. And in
I
both
think it took me
versions,
years to
yeah.
notice it. Like honestly, I don't think I noticed it for the first 3 years I looked at that painting.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But then looking at the prints, it is much more apparent that there's a veil
Oh,
there.
it's present.
Yeah.
It is present.
Um, and I'll just, we'll look at some more reproductions here in a second, but, one thing that we haven't brought up that is, of course, very important to note is that the prints don't reproduce color, and color is very important in Leonardo's production. And it's not to say that there weren't prints that incorporated color, it's just color if there were color in prints, they would have had to have been done by hand, and that would have been expensive, more time consuming, and made the print, you wouldn't have been able to make as many, they would have been more expensive, they wouldn't have been as accessible. And people did do that, but it was just less common. Maybe we can go to the slide where we have some color reproductions.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
And as you can see, even reproducing this color,
Mhm.
it's extremely limited in a reproductive technique like this. So,
Mhm.
I mean, you can reproduce color, but you can't do it with the same delicacy that you can with. I mean, it was oil painting that the Mona
Mhm.
Lisa is painted in, but I mean, in addition to that, it's also the finishing that
Mhm.
Leonardo put on it, and like how he kind of built the color into the finishing itself.
Mhm.
So it's flat, right? Like the
Yeah.
color is totally flat in this woodcut.
Flat, but also still really like saturated and vivid. It just doesn't, there's not the blending that happens through the technique, through precisely what you're talking about, the kind of finishing. It doesn't have that blended gradation from tone to tone. So it just feels much bolder and much more saturated than what we actually get in the painting itself.
I feel like it's like most noticeable in like these little like details, like in the
Hmm.
in the landscape. I mean, the landscape is so significant to it, and I feel like maybe this woodcut does not a terrible job in this part of the landscape,
Yeah.
but this part I do not feel like this technique captures the depth
Yeah.
that's there, and the colors don't feel right. And I'm sorry, on this one, that hand feels a little wrong too.
Yeah.
It looks like an old man's hand.
I mean, I agree with you, and I'm always drawn to the boldest, most garishly colored things, even in reproductions of canonical masterpieces. So, like my eye immediately goes to that one. I'm like, that's the one I would want for my home. Um, but yeah, I feel
Yeah.
like it also kind of, I always describe the background landscape in the Mona Lisa as very Mordor-like, and
Yes.
like that definitely is apparent in that print.
I feel like I mean, that essay talked a little bit about romanticism too, but like
Mhm.
when I read Bram Stoker's Dracula when I was in like high school, and it was after I'd been into Leonardo for a couple of years, the backdrop of the Mona Lisa was like the setting of like Transylvania for
Yeah,
me
for
in
sure.
my imagination. But yeah, it's got that like it's dark, it's mysterious, but it's
Hmm.
like it's foreboding, you know. Nature's not as welcoming as it's presented in like a lot of portraits,
Yeah.
especially some of the ones we've looked at in class.
Yeah, I mean, you
Uh,
compare the Leonardo to, relatively contemporaneous Raphael paintings where there are these very clean, serene, idyllic landscapes, and this it's like it's not very welcoming. Um,
no.
but the color one I think is a really good, as you indicated, like really good indication of or iteration of atmospheric perspective, especially that transition to the blue of the background. Like that is such a common way of creating atmospheric perspective, is that like blue tone.
Yeah.
But again, it is so, the visual planes in that background are so starkly delineated. So you have that brown, craggy Mordor like middle ground, and then
Yeah.
then there's like a line that goes to the blue background.
Yeah, and it's just like it feels disjointed. They don't feel it doesn't there's no harmony. Uh
Hmm.
like I feel
It,
like the harmony is disrupted by that. That said, the veil on this one
hmm.
is pretty good.
It's
It's
pretty good. Yeah.
like this part of the veil. This part, I don't know, like it's the red hair kind of
Hmm.
draws it out for me. Uh I don't
I,
know,
I also
right?
feel, yeah, no, I agree. And I also feel like the modeling of the face, I mean, it's a little choppy in that one, and it looks. I don't know if you've seen that reproduction of the Mona Lisa that came, what was around, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years ago. That was like with the duck lips. It's like
I have
Mona
seen
Lisa,
that.
like, and I feel like this is the closest to that as I've seen.
Yeah, the smile is like it's not quite right in this one too.
Yeah.
Like it's a little bit short.
Hmm.
Uh and the modeling, like I feel like the eyes are really good in this one. I do feel
Hmm.
like the eyes
Yeah.
are pretty close, especially comparative to this one, which I'm excited to talk about.
Yeah.
But I feel like the eyes are pretty close. I feel like the nose is kind of close. There's something that's like it's missing a little bit of the depth on the nose, but I feel
Yeah.
like there's some things in the facial features that uh this artist really used the technique of wood cutting to bring out. And I think it's important to acknowledge that like so many people were trying these different techniques because it was so difficult to reproduce this painting.
Yeah.
Uh but
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. And that was why I like including all of these prints, is you have these different techniques, and mezzotint and lithograph. Those are not techniques we've talked about yet, and we can, but we could also skip past that. But you could go through each one of these prints and talk about what does print A effectively capture about the about the painting, and all of them do something
yeah.
better than the other ones do in reproducing aspects of the Mona Lisa, but none of them are full, 100% perfect reproductions of that painting.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So with lithography, you do it
Which
on
comes way
limestone.
later, just again to
Comes
clarify timeline.
way later. Yeah, we are way later in time now. And it's a kind of complicated process. And
Don't
it
even
gets
try to
popularized
explain it.
really, really popular later. Yeah. But you
This,
kind of etch it into the stone. There's like a chemical and a water bath. You carve it in reverse. You pull this, you like, it burns it into the stone. The actual like chemicals burn the image into the stone, and then they paint ink onto it, but there also has to be water on it. And then you roll the thing through a press like the other techniques, and it comes off the stone. Now it gets a lot of detail, and the artist can like kind of just draw on the stone, but the stone also loses every print, like it loses a little detail. So like it has a limited run, and a lot of artists will just do the next one right on top. Once they run a round of prints, I think 500 is what it ends up being about average.
Yeah.
So burn engraving, they're using this small tool. And it kind of looks like an awl or something. It's got like a ball on the end of it that you can't see here, but it's this tiny little tool. They etch it into this copper plate. And then after it's etched in, they run the ink over it. They wipe the ink off, and the ink actually sinks into these grooves. So it's very similar to drawing. But it has to be reversed, as you can see in the final one. So they kind of put the ink in these grooves, and then they run it through this press, comes off, and we've got this beautiful image. And like we discussed on that one, you can kind of see the edges of the plate and some of the darker, the background gets a little bit of color because of that.
Mm-hmm.
So now,
can you go back to the Buren one? There are just a couple points I want to emphasize.
Yeah, please.
About this. Yeah. So one is that it may seem a little counterintuitive, but because you think like metal is stronger than wood, like the wood you'd use for a woodcut. But in terms of making prints, wood is actually much stronger, much more durable. So you can make many, many more prints from a woodcut versus one of these metal plates. These metal plates, it's usually copper up through.
Super soft.
It's super soft, but at the same time, it's not quite like drawing because there is this kind of mechanical and physical component. You are actually cutting metal out of the plate. So there is again a kind of mechanical aspect that makes it less like drawing, whereas lithography, you are drawing with this kind of wax crayon directly onto the stone. And that's one of the things that people liked about lithography. It is chemically and technically more complicated than engraving, but if you want something to look more like a drawing, it allows for that more than something like engraving does.
So this is an engraving. And this is the one we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, this is the one that, just to give a tiny bit of background, he drew it in 1824. All these artists were like, this is the best reproduction I've ever seen of the Mona Lisa. And this guy kind of got obsessed with making a perfect engraving of it. So he drew it in 1824. He makes an engraving in 1857.
And it takes a long time for him to do this engraving.
Long time. He had other commissions along the way, and it was like his passion project. This guy was like connected to the Mona Lisa in so many ways. The atmospheric perspective, the way that this just kind of subtly blends right here, and that would have just been such delicate work with that Buren to get these just subtle lines. And then the veil is just incredible in this print. And honestly, I feel like looking at this print, I probably would have noticed the veil a little bit more than I do even in the painting. Just because of these subtle lines here on over the head, but it's not opaque like it was in the other ones. You're still seeing through that material, this very delicate, fine material that would have been very difficult to produce in the 15th century. That's one of those signifiers of her wealth, in my opinion, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, just the hair follicles, how much attention is given to those details. And again, you have to remember, we just saw that animation with the metal plates. You can see how that actual carving of the metal works. Now imagine someone doing that to create this. That is
insane.
An insane amount of work. And one thing that I also think is worth underscoring is the fact that Kalamata, so the printmaker who made this this print, he fashioned himself as this kind of as this person who was obsessed with this project. And there are stories of other artists coming into his studio and admiring all this labor that he was putting into this reproduction. So in a sense, I mean, there's an extent to which Kalamata is creating value around his own work as a reproductive printmaker. That is, and there were people who argued that this print, Kalamata's print, was better than the painting. And that was not an
Yeah.
uncommon thing in at this time because it's not, we can't think of it as a literal translation of the painting, because you can't get that with a medium like engraving. But there are people who would look at this print and say things that Leonardo was trying to do in the painting that he didn't quite get right, this does a better job of. So there was this.
And there were like the problems with the painting's quality, even when he was working with it, like the varnish had started to yellow.
Yep.
Some of the details of the color were not as visible anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, so this became, its own like important entity, and again, certainly added to the value of the painting, and even less, necessarily in terms of monetary value, although it probably did that too, but just cultural value. It's standing within the public consciousness. Is the next slide, is that the one that has the one from our collection?
Yep.
Okay, so part of the reason we're talking about this is, and this will come to play in the visual analysis assignment that Joshua is creating for this week, is that we have a copy of Kalamata's Mona Lisa print in the UWM art collection. Now, I don't know if I have actually done this before, putting our iteration side by side with another example here on the right. So I think this is worth sort of analyzing here a little bit, because there are some, we look at these, they do not look the same.
No, and that's, in my opinion, ours was a much later print than this one. That would be my guess. And it's kind of that same idea with lithography, where like every print, it's getting just a little bit different. And this, you can kind of see where this plate was probably starting to soak up more ink in certain areas, and where the press had actually, these details in the background that were so fine in this one are almost, the lines are losing their definition in this one. And you can also see where the copper itself, or whatever, I'm guessing it was copper for this one, the copper itself was starting to stretch out from the press, because every time you're rolling it through that material, the metal is actually going to flatten just a little bit more. And stretch out.
I'm going to go a step further, and I agree it's later. I don't think it's actually
the same plate.
I don't think it's the same plate. I think it is
a
reproduction of the Kalamata print. And I couldn't, the image of of this print that's in the UWM art collection is not super high res, so I want to see it in person before I make any definitive claims. But down there at the bottom, on the bottom right and left, very faint, and
wow,
wow, you've got. And this is common. This is standard practice in the history of printmaking, that you have the names of it's usually the designation is something like designer, the person who actually created the image, and then the engraver, who very frequently it was a different person. That the person who actually does the engraving is a different person than the person who designed it, and I can't remember what the text says down there. So
we can see L. Da Vinci on this side. And then this side, L. Kalamata. So I think you're right. I think you're right that this would probably have been like a reproduction of the reproduction. And they talked about that in that article a little bit, about that process and how stressed out he was the first time his original plate went through it.
Yeah. And a lot of times also, I would propose, and I would want to do more research to, again, definitively state, but it is not inconceivable that Kalamata had no involvement in, like, at all in the creation of this print. It was not uncommon for very famous reproductive prints to be reproduced in unauthorized ways by other printmakers and publishers. So what I would not be surprised to find out is that this is a reproduction by, some other company, some other printmaking workshop of Kalamata's reproduction of the Mona Lisa. And again, the Kalamata had gained so much esteem within the art world as being such a quality reproduction that, you know, it may have been too expensive to buy and reproduce, but if you have someone who makes a copy of Kalamata's reproduction and then says that it's Kalamata, even if it's not, you know, and sells it in that way,
because they can basically trace them onto the thing.
Yeah.
And if they're a skilled engraver, and lots of people were, because this was a high demand thing. After the press came out, books started flying off the shelves.
Yeah, exactly.
So, oh wow, mind blown. Like,
and you know,
cool observation.
And we don't have a date on this print, which is, and I should say, you know, there is a bit later on in the course, I'll be having a conversation. There's a recorded conversation between me and Lee Malik, who is the curator of the UWM art collection. And I believe in that conversation, we talk about the fact that, you know, we've got thousands and thousands of objects in the UWM art collection, and it is impossible to keep all the information on these objects updated. Sometimes they come to us with no information at all. So you just kind of have to piece things together. And there are plenty of objects that, you know, may be purported to be by so-and-so, and we find out aren't actually by so-and-so famous artist. But one of the things that is one of the valuable elements that lends is that still tells us a lot about any number of things. And that's part of the reason I love, you know, even if this isn't actually by Kalamata, but is a reproduction of a Kalamata, it still underscores that sense that it's not just the Mona Lisa that is famous and valuable, it's Kalamata's reproduction of the Mona Lisa that's really important and valuable, and that other people are trying to, you know, perpetuate and benefit from. But there are stark differences between these two. I mean, it has a kind of like wood grain or like taffeta, like, you know, surface appearance. It's
got a lot more texture in the surface, and like that could be from the printing. Like, my wife's grandmother collected a lot of lithography and a lot of prints and things like that. And so when she passed away, I helped kind of go through and organize some of the things for their family and look at them. But and you're right, like having provenance and things like that is almost impossible. But also, like when you're looking at these images closely, you notice a lot of differences in ones that are numbered 1 and ones that are numbered 500. And these are like really similar to those kinds of differences. So you almost wonder, like, if it was a reproduction, you know, it could have been a reproduction of like an early print. It could have been a reproduction of a later print.
Absolutely.
There could have been a number of details, but I think it still captures a lot of the qualities of the Kalamata. And like, there's some things in this that like, I feel like almost capture like the iconic life that the Mona Lisa has taken on after Da Vinci. Like, I mean, we think about the ways images like this are reproduced in textiles and on notebook covers, and like a lot of those things are more like kind of a silkscreen image. You see a lot of like black and white reproductions, and like Kalamata's that we have here, this like kind of finesse. Like there's almost this like iconic, you know, association with like the way these brows are burned in so dark. That like I feel like some details of this image almost capture like the kind of popular consciousness in the 20th century of the Mona Lisa better than the original painting in a weird way.
And that's, you know, again, that's what people looking at Kalamata's print at the time, some of them argued that was more effectively captured.
So this is the Gustave Le Gray. And it was after a Millet drawing of the Mona Lisa, which there's some controversy there as to whether it was what is his name, Francois?
So it was initially attributed to Francois, but it was actually Aimé Millet.
His son, right?
That
like did the drawing. But this is the like first photographic reproduction of the Mona Lisa, and it's a reproduction of a line drawing. And I think that's important because as we talked about in the very beginning, as Sarah talked about in the very beginning, color reproductions weren't available. So this image captured on photography would not have actually had much definition.
Mm-hmm.
And this one does because it's a line drawing, because they understood that the technique of album and printing was only going to produce contrast and value. So I think that that's really cool. But I mean, looking at this, even like thinking about the Kalamata, the nose immediately kind of like glares at me. The eyes are really good. The eyes, I don't know, the eyes aren't as good as the Kalamata though. Like the brows
face a little like more narrow, just slightly narrower than in the painting.
Yeah, it feels like slightly narrower on the left side of her face. And like, her chin, I don't know, like this part doesn't match up. Like there's a little bit too much shadow in there at the wrong angle. I feel like there's more of a curve here, a gentle kind of like curve, and this kind of is just kind of like wah. But I mean, he was pretty young when he produced this drawing, so like it's a commendable drawing. I'll give him that. The veil is pretty good on this edge, but he loses and at the top, I feel like the top was really good, but he loses that kind of transparency on the top edge that I don't even feel like you can really see in the original, except for in these fine areas.
And I think it's you know, to kind of tie all this together, I think it's important to you know, remember the kinds of concerns that artists who are reproducing existing paintings, the kinds of concerns and considerations that are in their minds. So, you know, we can think of this as the first or one of the first photographs of the Mona Lisa, as you said, but it's not a photograph of the painting. It's a photograph of a drawing of the painting. And there was a recognition that if you try to photograph the painting, it's not going to be as effectively captured. So that extra layer of translation through the drawing would lead to a better photographic reproduction. But as you point out in these details, the hand of Mie, you know, results in some discrepancies from the original painting that make it, you know, even more removed. There are all these layers of translation that go into reproduction, and it's something that we forget, or I mean, we're living in an era of high res digital images being available for so many works and at our fingertips, and that is so new. That is so distinct from the history of art, the history of reproductive imagery, of reproductive printmaking. And, you know, again, this is really only in the 21st century, I would say, that is even a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, I have like Picasso books, like from early reproductions of Picasso's in color, and they're glued into the book. You know, I mean, they like glue a color photograph into the book. It's like, we really, really have a lot of luxuries in the 21st century with being able to like look at a high res image of this. I mean, we can find images where we can zoom in on the minute details and look at the Mona Lisa larger than life tenfold at this point. But for years and years, it was these images.
Just to wrap up, can I share my screen briefly?
Yeah, absolutely, please.
This is really apropos of nothing other than it's one of my favorite articles to ever come out of The Onion.
I love The Onion.
But many museums do have Mona Lisas in prints. They're just not, you know, they're just not on display. But that's a thing that is referenced very commonly in my household when we talk about museums. Well, that shitty museum doesn't even have a Mona Lisa.
And now it will be in mine. That's amazing.
Yeah.
You got me. That's the first good real good laugh I've had today. Thank you.
Good. So I think we'll use this as an opportunity to end this discussion. Thank you, Joshua, for joining me. This was fun, and hope the you students enjoy it. Oh, one last thing I wanted to mention. Joshua brought up a really good word that I wanted to clarify, which was provenance, and that is the word that we use to describe the history, especially the ownership history of a work of art, who owned it, where it existed, etc. So if you hear that word provenance again, that's what that refers to. So thank you.
Want to hear a really short anecdote about that?
Yes, please.
So my father-in-law, when he was in college, went to New York and saw like a very early Francis Bacon exhibit and bought a Francis Bacon lithograph of the central panel of one of his triptychs. It was really cool, but when we sold it, I mean, it did well, but literally the only provenance he had was a little piece of paper that said how much he paid for it and was signed by Francis Bacon.
Wow.
And that was it. That's the only provenance. And there's so many pieces in that collection that had that. So, I mean,
that's amazing.
Something the galleries don't take into consideration that kind of blows your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that anecdote, and I will see you all soon.